Tomorrow offers new frontiers in science, adventure, and ideals. The atomic age, the challenge of outer space, and the hope for a peaceful and unified world.
Tomorrowland, a world of imagination and beyond, filled with science fiction fantasies and soaring space adventures. Minnie, so nice to see you. Hey, I've got a great idea. Why don't you and I take an out-of-this-world journey while the Imagineers tell us how they keep Tomorrowland from becoming Yesterdayland?
I think Tomorrowland was, from the beginning, the hardest land to do.
The biggest challenge when Walt Disney opened the park was Tomorrowland. So he assigned Ward Kimball to develop a series of television shows that would depict what it would be like when humans entered space.
Walt created a show, 2 shows on space. One of the films was actually brought back to Washington.
President Eisenhower was so delighted with these films that he ran them for Congress, and he told Walt, he said, these did more to get the American public behind the space program than any of the bills before Congress.
Because Walt had a way of taking a very complicated topic and making it understandable for, a mass audience.
It was an exciting and innocent time coming out of World War II. Freeways were new. The world on the move, as Walt called it, was something that we all dreamed about, getting behind the wheel of a car and being on the open roads.
Walt really loved the transportation stuff, and to have the train going through and the monorail, and originally in Disneyland, the Skyway and the jets and all of that, that was really wonderful action, things happening. And I think we're getting back to that now. John Hench has been one of the huge influences in Tomorrowland. And John designed that original Flight to the Moon, which was, I still think, was one of the best theaters we ever built, because it was kind of wobbly to go into the theater, and you felt like you were going somewhere very special. You weren't on cement, you were on some kind of like an astronaut going,
Walt Disney was such an amazing individual. He was fascinated with technology. He was fascinated with the future. He thought Disneyland could be a testing ground for new technologies. And so even though we think of the monorail and the People Mover as rides in the park, to Walt, they weren't rides. So he was always looking for ways that he could harness technology for entertainment.
The story goes that Walt was driving through a by-road in Germany, and all of a sudden this thing came out of the trees and streaked across the street. Got on the phone, he called Bob Gurr, and he says, I just saw a monorail go by. One of the great designers in Disneyland's history is Bob Gurr. And this is like 9 months before the opening of the submarine in the Matterhorn. He says, do you think we can have one of those in there by the time we open the other 2 rides? 9 months later, they had a monorail being opened by Vice President Richard Nixon at the time, running in the park. It's been the first daily operating monorail in America from 1959 until today.
In 1959, Walt Disney introduced the submarine voyage, and it was one of the first e-ticket attractions, which, for those who don't know what e-ticket is, an e-ticket was the most spectacular, the biggest, most elaborate shows in the park. And it was an instant success with the guests.
And there were 8 submarines built. They were amazing vehicles. They carried 38 passengers.
And Walt was very proud that he had the 8th largest submarine fleet in the world at that time. So it was treated like a real thing, and we had the Nautilus and the Skipjack and the George Washington, and it was a very authentic attraction.
You literally went into a submarine, looked through a porthole, through water, and went on this adventure underwater to the polar caps. And
all the way to the North Pole, for crying out loud. I mean, how great is that?
He went to the lost continent of Atlantis.
And you saw all sorts of sharks and fish and undersea volcanoes and mermaids.
And sea serpents.
And it was fantastic.
So it became my new favorite.
It was a great part of Disneyland.
Well, Walt would get into everything he did, and while he was filming the movie, Third Man on the Mountain, he decided that the thing he had to have next at Disneyland was a copy of the Matterhorn. Now, the interesting thing about the ride that goes on and around the Matterhorn Mountain is it's the first tubular steel roller coaster built in America. You see, Walt Disney was never into using statistics like that. He was giving people a fabulous journey through the glacier grottos of the interior of the Matterhorn. That was all that was important to him. Not that it was the first steel coaster or it brought to life a whole new way of doing things. It was the Matterhorn Mountain.
He never stopped looking for ways where technology could serve the storytelling. But it was never technology for technology's sake. It was always technology to help bring the story to life in magical ways for our guests.
Now, the Matterhorn, aside from being the first tubular steel coaster in the world, also has kind of a neat myth about it, and that is up above where the ride runs, which is up to about 2/3 of the way, is an area that they didn't know what to do with. Maybe Walt gave the cast members a chance to come up with what would they do with this space. Anyway, it ended up being a basketball court, and when ride operators and the guys that climb the mountain are finished doing their work, they can go up there and shoot a few baskets high above everybody else that's going through the glaciers below.
Space Mountain is one of the classic, iconic Disneyland attractions. You can't imagine Tomorrowland without Space Mountain.
As so often happens, the technology wasn't available to do what we wanted to do in Space Mountain, which is put people in a dark environment and run those vehicles around. You couldn't keep them separated. Computer systems weren't sophisticated enough when John designed that originally in 1965. But by the early 70s, we were able to do it.
When Space Mountain opened at Disneyland in 1977, it was created with the special effects that the Imagineers knew how to create at that time. Well, a lot's changed in the world, and guests to our parks see amazing things in movies and television shows in terms of magic. So our Imagineers and our R&D division here at Imagineering had to come up with new magic. Space Mountain will have the fantastic ride that you remember, but what you see is going to be new and unique in many, many ways. Tony Baxter and I were the team on Star Tours, and he was the director and art director, and I was the writer and show producer. You know, to me, George Lucas was like Walt Disney. And to get to be an Imagineer and work for George Lucas, it was really amazing.
George had seen that one of the ways that Walt kept his characters alive was by putting them as real characters in the park. And George saw that and as a way of keeping his characters alive, R2-D2 and C-3PO. And so we had the opportunity to work with George in creating Star Tours.
Well, George Lucas was one of the first kids into Disneyland and went there as a child and loved Disneyland. So he was thrilled at the idea of bringing his property into the park. The question was, how would we do it?
You know, back in the mid-'80s, when we were really searching for the next new thing, because these massive advancements were a part of what made Disneyland magical. And Randy Bright, head of our scripting and all of the films at that time, had been in England and visited a company that had what was a motion-based system that was used to train pilots. They were curious about, I wonder if this could be some kind of an attraction.
We saw the potential of allowing guests to physically be in the movie of Star Wars and have that sensation of being an X-Wing pilot and being able to live that fantasy in 3 dimensions, which is what our park's all about. So we rode the ride, we came back, we came up with a number of different ideas on what we could create as a storyline of that, met with George Lucas, he picked one, and off we went. Kids love games. It's a big part of the entertainment of their world. As Imagineers, our challenge is, how do we take that and interpret it in a Disneyland way? How do you step into a video game? Buzz Lightyear Astro Blasters is an Imagineering interpretation of putting you into a 3-dimensional video game where you are helping Buzz Lightyear save the universe from the evil Emperor Zurg. I think Tomorrowland, when Walt first opened it, was trying to be more science factual. It was a time when the space program was just getting started, and there was incredible interest in the public in the future. Today, the world moves so fast, and things change so quickly. We're pushing more towards fantasy in our future.